best-selling author of Candy Freak, Rock and Roll Will Save Your Life, Against Football, My Life in Heavy Metal, and many other brilliant works of fiction and nonfiction. He's also, with his friend author Cheryl Strayed, the creator of a much-loved podcast, Dear Sugars, during which the hosts attempt to practice radical empathy in response to listeners' most difficult personal belongings. In 2018, he published Bad Stories, a collection of essays that attempt to explain some of the cultural and political paths that have led us to our current moment in history with the aid of great works of literature. In June, his newest work will arrive in the form of William Stoner and the Battle for Life, during which he uses his favorite book, Stoner by John Williams, to examine the story of the inner life in America. Mr. Almond's books will be available for sale at the conclusion of the program, and he has agreed that he will sign. And I should warn you that after his last visit to our library, about 10 years ago, one of our library trustees declared she had met her new literary boyfriend. Is she here tonight?
Okay, great.
So
Okay.
I'll turn it over to him now to charm you all just
Wow. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Well, hold on. We'll see if it's warranted. Don't commit yet. Thank you guys, and you know, I love coming to libraries. I love that we have libraries. I love seeing that the parking lot is like hopping at 7 o'clock on a Thursday evening. That just gives me little happy feels. And I love the age diversity of this crowd. I believe there's a very cute little child back there. Awesome. Okay, well listen, I cannot compete with that child's cuteness, and if that child makes noise, let's not pretend there isn't a very cute child in the room. We can all just be like, wow, there's a cute kid, and we'll try to stay focused, but if our minds drift, that's okay. That's us being human beings. Okay, that works a lot better than muzzling the child, which is very unsuccessful. And I have 3 kids, and I write about them a lot in this book. In a way, I wrote Bad Stories. It was not like, oh, yay, having endured the 2016 campaign. I didn't want to like, oh, let me just immerse myself in examining what the hell happened. But the sort of the evening after the election, or maybe actually the night of the election, when it became clear what the result was going to be, like we sent our kids to bed. I have 2 daughters. They were at that time 10 and 3, and a 8-year-old son. And I think that my oldest daughter in particular, was very excited for obvious reasons. She was excited about the prospect of having a female president for the first time, right? A mere 100 and some odd years after women got the vote in this country. And when that was not going to be the case, I think like a lot of people, just everybody, I think, no matter where you are on the spectrum, it was really quite a shocking evening. And I just remember, if those of you who are parents know, children are never more wonderful and blessed than when they're asleep. There's this incredible warmth towards them. Like, oh, they're so precious and they're so well behaved right now. But I had this kind of instinctual sort of 2 realizations, one right on top of the other. The first was, oh God, how am I going to explain to these kids in terms that they would understand kind of what the adult world, the decision the adult world has made? How do I explain at a very basic level that a child would be able to, not a dumb child, smart kids. I think kids are actually really smart, a lot smarter than we oftentimes wish them to be. They see truth very clearly. You can't hide cruel from a kid. You know, they understand that. Nor can you hide that you should share things if you have them. Like, they're all socialists, you know, in their better moments. So at any rate, that was the first thought was, oh my God, how am I going to explain to these kids sort of what happened? And then the second thought was, if I, as a white guy living sort of a upper middle class life, really cosseted by my own privilege, if I'm having worries, a kind of real sense of like, oh, am I going to be able to protect these kids? Which sounds a bit histrionic, but remember how we were all feeling, many of us, after that evening. Then what is a parent who's equally a parent to me? We all have the same feelings of adoration and terror and love, kind of almost uncontrollable love for our children. What is a parent who's a Muslim American feel at this moment? What does a parent who's African American, what does a parent whose status is uncertain, whose legal status is uncertain in this country? What do they feel? And maybe even their children's legal status is uncertain. How do they feel in this moment? You know, we talk a lot about, and I don't want to say this in a way that is at all confrontational, but I think we talk a lot about our feelings. People who live within a certain kind of privilege talk a lot about their feelings. And I was thinking, well, what about people's actual circumstances? So at any rate, that got me going towards thinking, well, what do I have to say about this? And I found myself saying, well, really, the way that I understand the world is through stories. And I think actually the way that stories function is that we're a storytelling species. Stories are the basic unit of human consciousness. They're how we construct reality, the reality that lives inside of us, our inner life, and also the world around us. That's how we construct meaning. That's why we pluck meaning from this rush of experience that's coming at us. And so I'm not a political scientist. I'm not a journalist. I'm sort of an apostate journalist. So I just, in Bad Stories, tried to understand what was happening and what's been happening to our country for a long time, not through the lens of the terrible outcomes, kids being separated from parents and, environmental regulation, whatever, all the bad outcomes. Politicians all across the spectrum kind of lying or acting in the interests of their donor class rather than the interests of normal citizens. All these things that we can kind of react to with distress and horror and confusion. All of those bad outcomes are really authored by bad stories. If you trace it back, if you tell stories that I call, you think of as good stories, stories that are intended to enlarge our moral imaginations, to make us more merciful, to make us more aware of the suffering of other people, and to make us feel some sense of responsibility for their suffering. These ideas, in fact, that suffuse our religious myths. After all, the Sermon on the Mount is entirely devoted to the notion that it is the least among us who should be exalted and cared for, right? That's what that whole book, and especially that sermon, is about. Those kinds of stories tend to lead to good outcomes. We become more merciful and more compassionate and more concerned. And on the other side, if you tell stories that are wishful or willfully naive or propagandistic or that are intended to blunt our moral imaginations, to reduce whole groups of people, kind of flatten them out into a dark other, then inevitably the results are going to be bad. And rather than getting our heads stuck in the news cycle, I wanted to take a big step back from history and try to understand, with the help of some books that I've thought about for a long time, like what are the bad stories that have led us to this moment. So I just want to read a little bit from the book, and then I'd really most just like to take questions if you have them, and have a discussion rather than me just reading at you. Sound okay? Okay. As I struggled to make sense of the 2016 election, my mind kept spiraling back to one particular scene in American literature. Ahab, perched upon the quarterdeck of the Pequod, a, quote, grand, ungodly, godlike man with a prosthetic leg fashioned from a whale's jawbone. The captain has come to announce the true nature of his mission, which is not economic in nature, but deeply personal. He seeks revenge against the Leviathan that maimed him and exhorts his crew with a soliloquy Trumpian in pitch, if not diction. And here's Ahab on the quarterdeck of the Pequod roaring at his crew. All visible objects are but pasteboard masks. If man will strike, strike through the mask. How can the prisoner reach outside except by thrusting through the wall? To me, the white whale is that wall shoved near to me. Remember, he's had his leg bitten off by a whale. He's been unmanned by this whale, and he's so hung up on it that his prosthetic leg is a jawbone of a whale. Okay? To me, the white whale is that wall shoved near to me. Oh, Melville's prose, shoved near to me. Sometimes I think there's not beyond, but 'tis enough. He tasks me, he heaps me. I see in him outrageous strength with an inscrutable malice sinewing it. That inscrutable thing is chiefly what I hate, and be the white whale agent or be the white whale principal, I will wreak that hate upon him. Talk not to me of blasphemy, man. I'd strike the sun if it insulted me. That is not just the subtext of every tweet from our president. It's the actual text. It's what he's saying every time out. It's almost numbing in its predictability. It is this volcanic sense of grievance that fuels Melville's saga, that binds the crew of the Pequod to their leader. Quote, Ahab's quenchless feud seemed mine, Ishmael tells us rather helplessly. Who can blame the kid? Ahab is something like a natural force, a vortex of vindication as mighty as the beast he pursues. And then I'll just ruin the end of Moby Dick for you. After 4 years of maniacal pursuit, they find the whale and they attempt to kill the whale, and it does not go well. The wounded whale winds up killing everybody aboard, including Ahab, dragging him to his death, with the exception of Ishmael, of course, who survives by clinging to this coffin that's made of American wood. Symbolism alert, okay? Melville is offering a mythic account of how one man's virile bombast can ensnare everyone and everything it encounters. The setting is nautical, the language epic, the allusions biblical and Shakespearean, but the tale, stripped to its ribs, is about the seductive force of the wounded male ego, and how naturally a ship steered by men might tack to its vengeful course. The plot of Moby Dick pits man against the natural world, and the women in the audience are going, tell me something I don't know. The plot of Moby Dick pits man against the natural world, but its theme pits man against his own nature. The election of 2016 was, in its own way, a retelling of this epic. Whether you choose to cast Trump as agent or principal hardly matters. What matters is that Americans joined the quest. Whether in rapture or disgust, we turned away from the compass of self-governance and toward the mesmerizing drama of aggression on display, the capitalist id unchained, and all that it unchained within us. Trump struck through the mask, and it was enough. When I started writing this book in the months after the election, I was furious and frightened, worn down by decades of disappointment, and determined mostly to launch harpoons at those I imagined to be my adversaries. But I am struggling in these pages to see Trumpism in a different light, as an opportunity to reckon with the bad stories at the heart of our great democratic experiment, and to recognize that often embedded within these bad stories are beautiful ideals and even correctives that might help us to contain the rage that has clouded our thoughts. I've taken Ishmael as my guide here, for while it's true that he falls under the spell of Ahab's folly, as did I. He is also its only surviving witness and chronicler, the voice left to impart whatever wisdom might be dredged from the deep. Amid the spectacle of a mad captain and his murderous quarry, we mustn't forget that Moby Dick is a parable about our national destiny, in which the only bulwark against self-inflicted tyranny is the telling of the story. So that's kind of what I'm up to. And I want to just read a few other just short sections here. I really like just using a bunch of authors who I'm a big admirer of. Ray Bradbury I talk about in the book, and Vonnegut, James Baldwin, Hannah Arendt, a number of writers who have been telling us what's coming. They've been essentially saying, look, none of these are new stories. These are all stories that we've been struggling with for a long time. Let's see. Okay, clunk. And I'm struggling, although I understand that I have a particular political and moral perspective. I really feel that it's a terrible, terrible mistake to try to locate all the virtue on one side of the political spectrum. It's just a terrible, terrible error. I think it's honestly kind of the right's error, and I don't want it to be the left's. So this is a little section that's a little bit about that. On the day after the election, I went swimming with my son Jude. We were in Florida at a writing conference, and on the way to the hotel pool, I spotted a young father with his daughter who looked to be about 3. She was seated on a chaise lounge next to her dad, happily munching on potato chips. And of course, I had a 3-year-old as well at that age, at that time. Let's not have any more snacks, the dad said. It's going to be dinner soon. The girl continued to feed chips into her mouth at a slightly greater clip. Good luck with that, I said to the dad ruefully as I passed by. He laughed, and we felt that instant kinship shared by fathers of young, iron-willed daughters against whom we know ourselves to be essentially powerless. Some minutes later, my son pulled me to his side in the shallow end. Look at that man, he whispered. Look at what he's wearing. I glanced up and saw the young father with whom I just shared a moment of levity, a bright red Make America Great Again hat perched on his head. Jude wanted me to react with horror, or at least indignation. But I had no idea what stories had led this guy to put on that hat. I knew only that he was a father like me, an American on vacation and at the mercy of his lovely daughter. To make any further judgment about him would be a failure of moral imagination. We're suffering from enough of that already. The real question then is, what stories guide our fellow citizens? How have these stories led so many to squander their franchise, to accept the idea that we can be united by those who sow discord or made great without admitting what, in our weakest moments, we are? Amid the constant prod of monetized distraction, can we slow down and start to connect the dots between our compulsive consumption of entertainment and the degradation of our public discourse, between the bread and circuses and the corrupt leaders? Can we activate what David Foster Wallace called the deep need to believe? If we're ever going to get out of this mess, we can no longer fritter away our passion on tribal contempt. We have to fight in a new way. We have to be the fools in charge of forgiveness. That passage sometimes makes people frustrated or angry, and I do think that it's appropriate to feel a lot of anguish and even a certain amount of anger when I think about, for instance, what's happening on the border, or any parent or any person should just feel like, wait a second, kids are being taken from their parents at these young ages and put in these kind of chain link cages. But the way I think of it is, yes, anguish is completely understandable and action is required, if you know what I mean. I just want to read you one other quote, which comes from Joseph Conrad. So I'll read a little bit that sort of sets it up. We must resist what the poet Wallace Stevens referred to as the pressure of the real. Have anybody heard that term, the pressure of the real? The manner in which our souls become desensitized by the grim and unending procession of accounts we call news. We mustn't succumb to a panic that robs us of our imagination, our capacity to contemplate and wonder and invent. It's not enough just to fight bad stories. If that's all we do, we will become trapped in a reactive cycle, debunking one outrage after another with no greater mission than mitigation. We have to be able to dream up stories that offer a vision of the American spirit as one of kindness and decency, the sort that powered the Emancipation Proclamation and the New Deal and the war on poverty, and we could add to that suffrage and the labor movement and so forth. Joseph Conrad, so famous for peering into our heart of darkness, never lost his great faith in the act of storytelling and the pursuit of art more broadly. Scientists and thinkers, he observed, make their appeal to those qualities that fit us best for the hazardous enterprise of living. The artist, by contrast, speaks to our capacity for delight and wonder, to the sense of mystery surrounding our lives, to our sense of pity and beauty and pain, to the latent feeling of fellowship with all creation, and to the subtle but invincible conviction of solidarity in dreams, in joy, in sorrow, in aspirations, in illusions, in hope, in fear, which binds men to each other, which binds together all humanity, the dead to the living, and the living to the unborn. All right, so that's, I think, all I'm going to read, unless questions, maybe, I want to read something that responds to a question, but I'd much prefer to take questions from people or comments if that's how the Spirit moves you. The book. We can also sit in a kind of stunned silence for a minute. That would be okay too. But I'm certainly familiar with that. So.
So you tend to, it feels like you wanted to write the book in order to make sense of things. I mean, it's sort of like you're telling yourself a story.
Yes, yes.
And you also, one of the things, I just recently, last summer, spent most of my summer gardening and listening to your Dear Sugars.
Oh, yeah.
And what struck me the most was that at the end of each one of those episodes, I would end up with a reading list.
Right.
Because you also, during those conversations, were also telling stories or putting it into a literary
Right.
format. And is this how you live your life? Is it in your brain? Like some people have songs that come up with everything. Are you constantly telling yourself a story?
Well, I think everybody's constantly telling themselves a story, if you know what I mean. That's kind of how, we don't think of it that way, but for instance, like our desire to kind of tell people or confess to our partner or our children or our therapist or our coworker is like a compulsive attempt to make sense of our lives. And I think what art is trying to do is engage with bewilderment. It's a kind of productive engagement with bewilderment. That is, there are all these things that are genuinely bewildering. Why do people die? Why do we lose people? How do we survive those losses? How do we emerge from an unhappy family or from the sorrows of childhood or the sense of powerlessness that we feel in childhood? How do we overcome those things which are really in the groundwater of our being? They're kind of large constituent parts of what we think of as our soul. How do we overcome that? How and why do we engineer relationships that end in disaster? Why does a marriage have to end? Why do we become estranged from our children? And the list goes on, or from our parents. And these are things that people, like my work at Dear Sugars instructed me in, or just reminded me kind of every day, that people are really carrying a lot of sorrow and a lot of confusion. And the only way that they start to gain some purchase on it or make sense of it is by telling that story. That's why our inbox is filled with 24 letters a day of people writing these wrenching confessions. It was people who were bewildered, who were trying to use the story, tell the story to make sense of it in some way. And in that sense, bad stories really aren't limited. I'm writing about politics and our public morality. But we're telling ourselves bad stories all the time. I'll just have one chip, just gonna have half a cookie, right? Or I promise I'll love you forever, if you know what I mean. The reason that he gets so angry is because he loves me so much. I mean, come on, let's be real for half a second in America. We're always kind of trying to, in some ways, delude ourselves into accepting things that are painful or confusing, in some ways sometimes unbearable. And only by correcting those bad stories do people start to get better outcomes. And that's a difficult and painful thing to do. And I think and hope and kind of pray as much as a kind of secular humanist can that America is trying to undo some bad stories, or that citizens of good faith are becoming more aware that if they don't actively try to get a better set of stories, this is the result. We're going to have constant propaganda. We're going to have constant culture war, sowing of division, pettiness, being sort of ruled by one person's limp dick ego. And it's just beneath our dignity as a country, regardless of what your politics are. This is not, again, having kids, like, you can't hide from a kid that it's cruel and wrong to tease disabled people. You know, to flatten out, and on down the line. So we're in this state where the sort of dominant storyteller is dragging us into the gutter, and we have to drag ourselves out, and that requires recognizing, like, we have lost our way. And only by enough citizens of good faith committing themselves to telling better stories and becoming more engaged as citizens are we going to get out of it. The reason that we become vulnerable to, I think, bad political actors, regardless of their sort of where they are on the political spectrum, is because the winner of the election was the 104 million Americans, eligible voters who didn't vote. The winner got 63 million, the loser got 66 million, and 104 million people just didn't even bother to vote. And believe me, Putin saw that. Putin knew that he couldn't defeat us militarily. Putin knew that he couldn't defeat us economically. In fact, the efforts to defeat the American empire in those ways had led to the disintegration of the Soviet bloc, right? Students of the Cold War. But if you're, and there's a whole chapter in the book, one of the bad stories is the Cold War is over and we won. But if you're Vladimir Putin and you're looking, hey, and you're looking at the United States and you were one of those KGB officers who saw the Berlin Wall come down and who was frantically burning all those Stasi files and saw George H.W. Bush say, this is the greatest victory in the history of the United States, and you had to swallow that, you would bide your time and you would think, where, if you were a KGB operative, where is America vulnerable? What is America vulnerable to? And they're vulnerable to bad stories. And Putin understood that was our Achilles heel. And he didn't even have to do much. He got WikiLeaks as a front, as a sort of to cut the drugs and get them out onto the street. And our own free press acted as his press agents, right? Remember, when Watergate arose from a break-in to the Democratic National Convention, a bunch of people burgled some dirt on the Democratic candidate. And the scandal that arose from that was, oh my God, some crook tried to steal dirt on a political candidate. Well, that's exactly what happened in 2016. People stole information on the Democratic candidate to try to disseminate it, and those people were agents of the Russian government, of the Kremlin. And our free press did not ask, who got this information? Where did it come from? And why did they want it distributed? So I guess I've wandered a bit, but my point is that when you don't think about, when you sort of don't step back, you consent to an arrangement where there's the Washington Post and the New York Times and the other sort of most respectable organs of journalism in this country essentially doing Putin's bidding. And we all don't even bat an eyelash about it. Right? Other questions? Comments? Sorry, that wandered a bit. But yeah.
So in your book, you're not all that complimentary of the state of the media today. So, and what you just said leads me to ask, where do we get our information from? Where, Facebook, New York Times, can someone reliably get good stories, I guess?
Yeah. I definitely am pretty critical because the overall coverage of policy, does anybody know what percentage of the coverage was about policy in the 2016 election, just by percentage? 10. But that's another way of saying it is 90% was about, other stuff. Scandal, fundraising, ... I think that part of what it's tough because what's happened is not that there's some sort of boogeyman behind a curtain. It's just that the free press is a for-profit press. And ultimately, if we continue to consume, if our media diet is the consumption of pundits yelling at each other and turning every policy debate into a binary, into a kind of brawl, televised brawl, where we're really sort of feeding on Schadenfreude and who won, and it becomes almost a sporting event, well, then that's what we're going to continue to get. It's very hard to turn away from that kind of spectacle. And the media feeds us. In a capitalist society, we vote. We vote with our money and our attention. And if we give our attention to sort of spectacle, then we will dependably get that. One of the things I write about in the book is one of the bad stories is the idea that our court jesters will rescue the kingdom. I think on the right, they've constructed the sort of conservative media has tried to construct the story of America as a horror movie, where there's always some dark other hovering on the border ready to invade and take the jobs of hardworking white people, just to put it bluntly. It's a kind of ecstatic cult of white victimization. And so we could be critical of that, or say, gee, why is it that sort of propaganda is allowed to exist? And there's a chapter about that, which is about the fairness doctrine, which I think was the bulwark against propaganda in this country. And I'll discuss that in a sec, but I want to say that the left has its own version of America, and that's America as a farce, America as a comedy, where everybody in the media is corrupt and everybody in Washington is corrupt. That's essentially the message of even the great comedians, Stewart and Colbert and Samantha Bee, and they're all essentially saying the same thing. You can't trust people in Washington, they're all crooks. And furthermore, the proper response to that sense of disappointment and outrage and heartbreak is that you should laugh about it, because otherwise you might cry or you might be too angry. But we should cry, and we should be angry. We shouldn't have that kind of therapeutic, well, let me just laugh at it, otherwise I'll get too upset. But we should be upset that in our name, kids are being separated from parents who are already fleeing violence and mayhem. What parent would take a kid 2,000 miles if they weren't running from something really scary? Come on, just use your moral common sense here. We should be upset that teachers are barely earning a living wage. We should be outraged about that. We should be outraged that we cannot do the common basic math that every other industrialized country has done and say, gee, if we make it harder for people to get guns, then fewer people will get shot up with guns. Come on. There's all these issues where there's this disconnect. And I think the left's response, and it's a normal temptation, is to just not take it seriously, to just sort of watch these very brilliant comedians convert a sense of civic distress into disposable laughs. And in that sense, everybody's complicit. I don't believe in this idea of like all the iniquitous bad impulses and behaviors exist over there on the other side of the spectrum. That's nonsense. We're all the authors of the American story. So part of it is about changing our media diets and saying, I do not consent to watching programs where people are yelling at one another rather than discussing substantive policies. And I will write a letter to the editors saying, I don't want to hear about the latest scandal or fundraising numbers. And I will call my local NPR affiliate and say, you had an entire segment in which all you talked about was the candidates' personalities or what they were wearing or what their voice was like, and you didn't talk once about what their intentions are, what policies they want to enact. This was there wasn't one question about climate change in any of the three debates, not one. The central existential threat that's bearing down on the entire species. So a quick word about the fairness doctrine for people who aren't familiar with it. I think it is one of the most important and unspoken about civic measures that was ever put in place. And I'm just going to give you a really quick description of it. When mass media came along in the early part of the 20th century, radio came along. And you have to realize the founders never anticipated a media form that could reach millions of people simultaneously. Radio was miraculous and also incredibly powerful. And smart lawmakers realized that they were kind of playing with a fire that was on a scale that they'd never experienced. And what they proposed was, they said basically, whoever gets control of the licenses to use these public airwaves, if they fall into the wrong hands with an agenda, a partisan agenda or a business agenda, they will rule the hearts and minds of Americans and distort what our priorities are and what our sense of reality is. And so they wanted to put a mechanism in place to regulate the kinds of news that the owners of stations would broadcast. And what they put in place was really basic. All they said was, if we're going to give you a license to use the public airways, it has to be in the public interest. You cannot just make it for-profit propaganda. And also, you can't just broadcast one opinion. You have to broadcast all shades of reasonable opinion. You cannot just broadcast one point of view or one agenda. You have to, when you're going to, you have a responsibility to discuss controversial issues, but you cannot simply broadcast one opinion. Now, the media landscape that we live in is really in a kind of epistemological crisis. Because if anybody has had a discussion, like I'll have a discussion with my in-laws, who I love dearly, but I have frustrating discussions with them. And one discussion I had with my really smart father-in-law is about the verified science behind the climate change. And he will say things like, Mother Nature will take care of herself, or we've had ice ages before, or da-da-da-da-da. And it doesn't matter how many reams of science I could present to him, he has a radio and TV station on all day that is saying to him, it's bullshit, there are a bunch of scientists who just want to scam money from the government by scaring you and making you feel guilty for driving your SUV. Which is frankly a really great story compared to, geez, your kids might live in an apocalyptic hellscape unless we wean ourselves from our luxuries and our conveniences. I mean, part of the reason that the stories that the right generates are so much more powerful is because they are, in a certain way, easier to contend with. They protect us a bit more. And so there's a sort of asymmetry. I sort of feel like there's an asymmetrical warfare, because people will often say, well, why isn't there a sort of a version of Fox News on the left? Well, because they don't consent to propaganda. They would know if they were making facts up. Like Rachel Maddow might have a perspective, but she's doggedly sort of bound by a code that says, I'm going to follow the facts, not I'm just going to say there are death panels when there aren't, right? And when you unmoor yourself from a responsibility to a reasonable shade of opinion, you can tell really wild stories, really scary stories, really dramatic stories. And those are the kinds that really excite people. Think about the fiction you read. Tom Clancy doesn't have lots of readers, or Stephen King or whoever else, because they write stories that don't have much threat in them. They're really successful because they know that if you ratchet up the threat level, people will be like this. Well, that's what Fox News supplies to my in-laws. A kind of constant scary fright show in which they're constantly feeling agitated and frightened, and they can't stop watching. What the fairness doctrine was trying to say is that's not allowed. You can't have for-profit demagoguery. You can't have propaganda. If you're going to present an opinion about a death panel, you actually have to present an opinion in equal. You have to give, on the same show, you have to have somebody say what's actually in the law. And the reason that that essentially didn't allow, I mean, the moment that the fairness doctrine was repealed, it will come as no surprise to many of you that it was under Reagan. The moment that that spoiler plate was taken off, what you saw was the rise of right-wing talk radio, and very shortly after that, Fox News. And if you really track what the voices in those mediums have been saying, it's exactly what Trump is saying. He didn't create a movement, he inherited an audience. And that audience had been tuned in for 20 or 30 years. And I know, because I'm one of the sickos who sometimes listens to it for my own very unhealthy reasons. But I'm curious, it's very seductive when somebody's saying they're coming to kill your grandmother. The story that the left has to tell is really kind of dull. We would like to improve healthcare delivery systems by very strategic government subsidies and involvement, and limiting the amount that private insurance corporations can limit coverage based on pre-existing ... All of that is crucial, but it's a lot sexier to say they're going to kill your grandmother. They're coming for your guns and your God and your granny. And that really is the message that I think if you're steeped in sort of heavy conservative right-wing media, and that's the reason why it's almost impossible to have a discussion, because they're not discussing, they don't want to have a rational discussion about facts. They're living within their emotional lives. And I'm not saying that in a way that I want to sound condescending. They're just as much citizens as everybody else, and they get just as much of a vote. And they have their own stories that they're telling. My mother-in-law is a devout Catholic, and she believes abortion is murder. And I think she has a duty, since those are her really deeply held, that's her faith. I think based on that, she has a duty to support candidates and causes that, that line up with that moral code. My quarrel really isn't with sort of individual voters or citizens, because they're just as much a citizen as anybody else. It's with media companies and a larger system that has deregulated media and treated it as a marketplace rather than as a civic institution. So anyway, that's a little bit about just sort of my views on media stuff. Yeah.
Can we go back to what he asked though about, so where do you find the right stories? I mean, for you. I mean, for some people, Fox News is their story.
Yeah.
It's their right story.
Yeah.
And for somebody else, it might be NPR, but then it's,
Yeah.
I mean,
I don't.
sift
Yeah.
through the stories and find.
Yeah. I'll tell you what my media diet is. And I don't say that it's like a perfect media diet, but like on my better days when I'm resisting the YouTube K-hole of right-wing demagogues being shown up or something, I read the New Yorker. I just think they're really smart and really on top of it. I think there are a few shows. I think Rachel Maddow does a good job, although she's really long-winded and takes a long time to get it across. But I think she does a good job of trying to trace back some of their stories to their origins and sort of keeps her eye on the big picture. Vox does a good job, which is a website of sort of explaining things, although I feel they kind of get too caught up in scandal stuff and pop culture stuff. And I think actually John Oliver is quite an interesting guy, because a lot of what he does is really in the tradition of the muckraking. It is really in the tradition of the muckrakers. It's explanatory journalism. And he'll take something like Payday Lenders and spend 20 minutes trying to say, here is how that scam works. And lots of people don't know that because we don't have dependable outlets that we can go to understand the mechanisms of how power is trying to extract money from us, essentially. So those are a few of the places that I look to, but a lot of what I do, if I'm honest, a lot of what I've been committed to in the past few years is just being more politically active. The Southern Poverty Law Center does very interesting, that's another organization that's really, really smart in sort of tracking hate groups and the intersection of sort of right-wing white nationalist extremism. But a lot of what I am doing is trying to sort of get out of the mode of passively consuming and do more active. The last election, I did workshops. What do I have that's of any value? Well, I teach writing. And so what I did is set up 6 or 7 workshops where the students basically paid $150 to a candidate or cause of their choosing. And then we all got together and they talked about which candidate or cause they chose. And the process of researching them was very comforting. I think part of the problem with the American definition of citizenship is that it's very passive. I mean, look, we have a voting rate that's lower than Turkey and Mexico. Okay? We really are complacent. And we sort of treated democracy like a self-driving car, and it's not. And so a lot of what I'm trying to do is do less frantic consuming. I mean, I stay apprised of what's going on. I'm aware that William Barr is staging a cover-up sort of in plain view. I sort of keep basically apprised, but I listen to podcasts as well, because they have deeper, longer, more sort of deeper discussion of stuff. I can't listen to NPR anymore. I just can't listen to it. It's passive reporting, and it gives you no tools to really say, well, wait a second, epistemologically, what's the truth here? It's just this person said this, that person said that. I don't care to hear 2 minutes about the fact that the president is in thus and such a place. I just don't care. It doesn't matter. It's information that I can't do anything with. So I've tried to do less consuming of that kind of passive reporting and much more gotten myself involved with candidates and causes. Which I think is kind of what's going to have to happen in 2020, because it's already quite clear, you guys who are maybe, follow the news carefully, you can see that this purge at the Department of Homeland Security is all about taking a really hard turn on immigration and demagoguing that. And that's what the next election is going to be. It's going to be, let me get my base as riled up. There's going to be that myth about, well, at some point he'll be a centrist or he'll try to grab voters in the middle. I think he's recognized as somebody who just wants to win and not get indicted. Nope, I just have to get my people in a froth. And that's going to be his strategy, and I think he's going to have an enabler in the media because they always feed on conflict and scandal, and that's their model. And they feed on it because we feed on it, to be honest. So I'm trying to sort of disconnect to some extent from sort of the media drip and much more convert it into activism or just citizen involvement, I could call it. So, any other? Yeah?
So I'm getting ready to go to Arkansas for a week to stay with my family over spring break. And I feel that one of the bad stories that we've told ourselves is that we're all Americans, so we're all alike. And actually, there are regions of the country. For instance, I consider myself, my dad's from Massachusetts and I was from Arkansas. I've lived half my life in both places. Mm-hmm. That New England couldn't care less about the South. And they don't know. New Englanders don't know what the Southerners are like. And the Southerners feel exactly the same way. My aunt always said, I didn't know damn Yankee was 2 words until I was 21. That's what she told my father. So that's, I feel that's part of, it's not all, it's a slice of this problem.
Well, there's a chapter in the book about sports and tribalism. It's really about tribalism and hyper-partisanship. And I understand what you're saying, which is that there are a lot of sort of stereotypes in both directions. But if we're really honest, people pretty much have the same agenda. If you cut beneath all of that stuff, which is kind of culture war stuff, they want their kids to do okay. They want to take care of the people, that they love. They want the government to do good in their lives and to function effectively. I think most people. I'm just saying most people, most citizens of good faith who are not under the influence of propaganda that is sort of predicated on putting their grievances before their vulnerabilities. If you dig beneath the grievances, most people want to make sure that if somebody in their life gets sick, that they're cared for and that they're able to at least have a chance to recover. And none of that has anything to do, and I don't want to say this in a rude way, but like your aunt was indoctrinated in some idea, but if she lived next to a damn Yankee, if you know what I mean, and she needed a cup of sugar or somebody to drive to the emergency room or to watch her child because she needed to drive to the emergency room, all that would go out the window, to be honest with you. That is just some set of stories that we have the luxury to tell ourselves, and to some extent maybe the vestiges of the fact that this country did have to litigate, and with a bloody war, a very different morality. And so the South and people in the South have a very deep-seated sense of being humiliated and looked down upon, and the North were hegemonic in their relationship toward the South in an effort to win the war, and after that in an effort to enrich themselves. But I think that one of the things that demagogues prey on is this idea that other people are looking down on them. And they really profit by the idea, this set of cultural myths, that there's this region of the country and that region of the country. I don't know a single region of the country where people aren't concerned about the same basic stuff. When you dig down beneath all the kind of bad stories that are at the top of it, I think people pretty much want the same things. And I think that, one of the good stories to emerge over the past couple of years is that teachers in West Virginia and Arizona and Oklahoma, states that are not, blue, whatever that means. I mean, you can find plenty of people in every place who feel all sorts of different ways. I think there's a bigger division, frankly, between people who live in urban centers and people who live in rural or semi-rural areas, right? Those are really the rubrics. Somebody who's in Little Rock at a big law firm has much more in common with a damn Yankee, right? But
Well, no, there's the theocracy down there too. That's the.
Well, yeah, but I think we're all kind of, yeah. I'm flattered, but I think I have to take care of my kids. They're on vacation next. I would love to go with you. I actually think the big theocracy in our culture is really much more capitalism. The incentive system is all around money and winning. And if you sort of boil the America down, I think part of the source of our difficulty is that all of the discussions that should be about morality wind up being about either who's winning or who's going to profit by it, right? But I will say that one of the things that because I lived in North Carolina, I lived in Miami and El Paso and sort of all over the place. I think my feeling is that generally speaking, most people are good and citizens of good faith. And when you see these teachers in these states, all they were saying was, wait a second, it doesn't make sense that we teach your children and we don't have a livable wage. Something's broken and we are not going to stand for it. And that's really what America's about. Every moment where we have had a bad story, a bad circumstance to contend with, or a bad story, like it is okay to own people as property, the changes that have taken place have happened because individual citizens, a whole millions of them, got up and said, I don't consent to that story. That's the story of emancipation and suffrage and the labor movement and the New Deal and the Great Society and the war on poverty. We had a war on poverty before the war on drugs, before the war on poor people. All of those social movements and policy outcomes were the result of individual citizens in the aggregate standing up and saying, I do not consent to this bad story. The Civil Rights Movement and the Civil Rights Act didn't happen because Rosa Parks stood up on a bus. That's not why that happened. It happened because millions of people said, we are living in sin. We're not living in grace, and we have to change how we're doing business, even if some people, even if it's at risk to my economic fate, even to my physical safety. We're capable of doing that, is the point. And I think we've lost that, to some extent we've lost a certain kind of courage. But I do see that I believe it is coming back. I think it's beautiful to see these new members of Congress, many of whom are young women, many of whom are young women of color, speaking in very basic terms about the fact that government is supposed to protect us from the interests of business, not be in alliance with business. The job of government is to break that unholy alliance. And what Ocasio-Cortez is saying is nothing that Teddy Roosevelt wasn't saying in 1910. Read his New Nationalism speech. It's absolutely beautiful what he says. Actually, let me see if I can find it. And maybe we'll end on that, because it is a beautiful story that I think people have lost. Okay. Reform in these areas is unlikely to come from members of our political or media class. Too many people make too much money off the current system. But if our citizenry is truly sick of the special interests, the lobbyists, the PACs, and negative ads, the mechanics of corporate influence, if they're sick of political lines being drawn by partisans and campaigns conducted exclusively in swing states and votes being weighted differently, then citizens must become a lobby, must push for laws that bleed money from politics and unrig our elections. This lobby should consist of nearly every citizen of this country who is not a billionaire, a demagogue, a network executive, a pollster, a consultant, or a politician. And that goes across lines. I hope your aunt would agree with me, okay? We just obediently handed 100% of the presidency to a candidate who received 3 million votes fewer than his opponent from barely 25% of the eligible voters. The same thing would have been true if Clinton had won. Is that the story of a democracy or a tyranny of the elites? None of these notions is new. They amount to a revival of what Teddy Roosevelt proposed in his famous New Nationalism speech of 1910. The former president argued that human welfare, and this guy had been a raging imperialist as a younger man, and as he grew older, he changed. He told himself a better story. He had more experience, and the world taught him, I think, some important things. The former president argued that human welfare should be valued above property rights, and that the federal government should safeguard social justice against corporate greed. The platform he outlined included a national health service, social insurance for the elderly and needy, an 8-hour workday, a minimum wage, workers' compensation, farm relief, an inheritance tax, a federal income tax, a securities commission. His political reforms included suffrage for women, the direct election of senators who were at that time selected by state legislatures. He also called for strict limits on campaign contributions, the registration of lobbyists, and the recording of all congressional proceedings, quote, to destroy this invisible government, to dissolve the unholy alliance between corrupt business and corrupt politics. This is 1910. Roosevelt sought to defend the founding principle of America. Remember, guys, this is the founding principle of America, equality of opportunity. Not equality of circumstance, but equality of opportunity. Quote, in the struggle for this great end, nations rise from barbarism to civilization, and through it, people press forward from one stage of enlightenment to the next. At many stages in the advance of humanity, this conflict, listen to this is so amazing, this conflict between the men who possess more than they have earned and the men who have earned more than they possess is the central condition of progress. And I would warrant that there are a lot of people who pulled the lever for Trump who would agree, I have earned more than I possess, right? In our day, it appears as the struggle of free men to gain and hold the right of self-government as against the special interests who twist the methods of free government into machinery for defeating the popular will. 1910. At every stage and under all circumstances, the essence of the struggle is to equalize opportunity, destroy privilege, and give to the life and citizenship of every individual the highest possible value both to himself and to the Commonwealth. That is nothing new. All I ask in civil life is what you fought for in the Civil War. Yay. When people say, well, what should the Democrats say? That's what they should say 100 times until they're blue in the face. And that is what I am hearing increasingly. There's a real elemental discussion that is sometimes breaking through the noise of the latest tweet fart, from politician A or demagogue B. We are starting to hear a basic discussion of how the people are getting trampled by interests that feel out of their control. Right? Anyway, I think that's a good place to end. Teddy Roosevelt is probably saying a lot more eloquently than I can. I have some of these books which would make a lovely gift for some of your friends in Arkansas. All of the proceeds from the books I'm contributing to the Southern Law Poverty Center that I mentioned before. Their work is really great. And they're $15, and I have a credit card thing if you don't have cash. And then I also have a little book that's $5 in case you really want to have an interesting conversation with your aunt. This little book is called Letters from People Who Hate Me, and it is actually letters from people who hate me. It was written in 2006, and it's their letters and my responses to their letters. Yeah, you want to hear one of those?
Yes.
All right. Well, they're pretty intense. They're pretty intense. I'll read you a couple of them because they're short. Dear asshole, you're a fucking idiot, and your daughter in the picture on your website looks like a maggot. You're a disgraceful American, and it would have been so nice if you'd been a passenger on one of the planes that crashed into one of the World Trade Towers on 9/11/01. Sincerely, Joseph Kelly. And then, of course, I have to respond. Dear Joseph, okay, you got me. My daughter does have kind of a maggoty look to her. For a while there, my wife and I were able to delude ourselves. I guess all parents do. We'd tell people her skin was alabaster or sometimes pearlescent. We thought it might be the kind of soap we were using. But I think in our heart of hearts we knew something was wrong with her. Then came her first interaction with carrion. There was some kind of dead animal in our backyard. My wife says it was a rabbit, but I'm almost certain it was an opossum. Anyway, Josephine somehow got wind of it, and we found her out there burrowing into the thing's eye socket. The neighbors came out to watch. It was kind of awkward. I guess it would be sort of like if you, Joseph Kelly, found yourself talking to some buddies at a party and you said, you know that guy Steve Almond, I totally wish he'd been killed in the 9/11 attacks. And this voice behind you says, yeah, totally, we should have killed that filthy infidel Almond. And you turn around hoping to maybe give the guy a high five only to discover that it's Osama bin Laden. That is awkward. That would be awkward. One more here that will give you a sense of what this book is about. It's a very short letter. It's just one sentence. Steve, you are such a pussy. Signed, Brian Holmes. And here's my response to Brian. Brian, a couple of things. First, the word pussy is spelled P-U-S-S-Y, not P-U-S-S-I-E, which I think would lead most people to conclude that I suffer from an excess of pus. I do not. Nonetheless, I get your point. You're not saying that I'm literally a vagina. You're saying that I'm a cowardly person. I'm not sure how the slang expression for female genitalia came to mean cowardly, but let's leave that aside for now. Here's the important thing. I am not a pussy or a coward. I'm a chicken shit. There's a big difference, Brian, and us chicken shits don't take kindly to being lumped together with all the pussies and cowards and wimps and wusses. Chicken shittery isn't just some fad for us, some trendy lifestyle decision. I am deeply committed to running away from any physical conflict while shrieking in a womanly manner. It's in my blood. The truth is I come from a long line of chicken shits. My daddy was a chicken shit, and my daddy's daddy, and his daddy before him, and so on that way back to the days of antiquity. In fact, according to family lore, one of our ancient forebears was a radical homeless pacifist who flounced around the Sea of Galilee saying chicken shit stuff like, if someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other to him also, and blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the sons of God. You can just imagine what happened to that fucking pussy. Okay, so that's, yeah, the letters are real. Yeah. Well, the reason I wanted to put this into the world, this was in 2006, and it was in, what I was trying to do was capture, in a way, that there was a significant and very politically active and vocal minority of the country that was constructing reality in a very different way from everyone else. A lot of other people were kind of shocked, like, oh my God, there's a lot of latent white nationalism and racism. But for me, it was, I'd been hearing from these folks for a while, where if you disagree with somebody politically, you can say that they are a maggot or a vermin, or they should go to a work camp. Or they should be killed in a terrorist attack, and so forth. The reason I wanted to put this out in the world, other than just being a freak, is that I felt it was important. They were saying something very powerful about how they construct reality. You could disagree or be horrified by the story they were telling, but it was a very potent, powerful story. And I felt like it needed to, we don't need the airbrushed version that we get on Fox News. This is really how a significant, the people who are there at those rallies saying, lock her up, who are really saying, lock up any woman who wants to have volition, and especially if they're ambitious. We're going to criminalize that impulse. It's important to recognize kind of what you're dealing with. And I wanted to sort of play with it a little bit and not run away from it or be horrified, but say, what are you really saying? I'm a pussy, so you're really saying that if I have these views that are too empathic, then I'm less of a man than you. I become a woman? Is that what you're saying? I want to understand what your worldview is and how you construct it. And I actually think that's really crucial. We're kind of airing some stuff that people have been sort of steeped in, but I think a lot of us are in our own way insulated from, right, within our sort of privilege. A lot of African Americans, people were kind of moaning and saying, oh God, this is just, how could this happen? I mean, this is the worst thing ever. And people of color are going, what? The worst thing ever? Why the hell do you think I'm in this country? What do you think, So in a certain way, I felt like these letters, even though they're disturbing and very visceral, they really are a kind of window into the mindset of people who are in a lot of pain, frankly. And that doesn't mean that I want them to make policy, but nobody is this angry unless they're really hurt at some elemental level. So, okay. I think that's probably enough. If you want any of these books, I'm happy to sign them. They're the feel-bad read of the year. That's what they're saying. And I appreciate your coming out. Thanks so much.